George Landrith from Frontiers of Freedom. And he has a panel that's going to discuss a multitude of issues, and we'll be able to take some Q&A on that also, along with Travis Korson in the middle. And we couldn't find anybody good, so we got John Fund to come in to sit on the end. John, I know you all know who John Fund is, and John's been at a number of these conservative conferences before, and it's always great to have him here. Before I turn it over to George, I just want to ask John one question. Is that all right, George?
Sure.
Okay. Is voter fraud real, John? Okay.
The fact that all they have to say about it is that it doesn't exist, the fact that the liberals have to say voter fraud doesn't exist tells you they really are hiding something big. You don't deny something completely unless you're hiding something big.
All right. George Landrith, go ahead.
Well, one, I want to say, I used to wonder if Chuck likes me. Now I know he doesn't. When you get stuck behind Herman Cain, and that's the act you have to follow, you know this man dislikes me deeply. Is that true or false? Okay. So, no, seriously, I've known Chuck a long time, so thanks, Chuck, for the opportunity to be here and including us in this. I want to thank you all for being here because this is an important thing. You know, Herman Cain talked about how we all need to do more. And you guys, you know, in some respect, we're preaching to the choir because you're the people doing that, and we need to recruit more to do that. But I want to thank you for taking time and money to be here and to care a lot about these things. That matters. Now, we've got a great lineup for you. We're going to start off with John Fund. And then I'll make some remarks, and then Travis will. And we're going to talk about some issues and try to apply principles to those issues, be very specific, and give you some ideas about issues that we see that are emerging and coming along that we need to be prepared for and ready to fight. So with that, we will have John Fund first, and then myself, and then Travis Korson. Just so you all know who John is. Maybe you don't know who I am. I'm the president of Frontiers of Freedom, an organization founded by Malcolm Wallop, a U.S. senator for 3 terms, a friend and ally of Ronald Reagan's. And Travis Korson is a senior fellow at Frontiers of Freedom. We are, as I said, all 3 of us glad to be here and glad that you are with us. John.
Thank you. Herman Cain is one of the great orators of our time. Seldom matched, often imitated. But you know, people who try to imitate Herman Cain, you know, it's both his talent and it's also the culture, the preaching culture that he comes from. They sort of remind me like Las Vegas Elvis impersonators. They may know the lyrics, but they can't carry the tune. So I cannot possibly compete with Herman Cain, but I will tell you this. I'm going to contribute something to his drain the swamp metaphor. I'll tell you what the real problem with the swamp in Washington is. Lots of people you elect sincerely believe the swamp should be drained when they come to Washington, but after they stay a few years, they think it makes a great hot tub instead. Speaking of hot tubs, here's a question for you. What do Harry Reid, you remember him, Joe Biden, Jerry Brown, Barack Obama, and the chambers of commerce of Dallas, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas all have in common? Well, they all have succumbed. Well, that's part of it. They've all succumbed to the high-speed train fever. High-speed, brainless boondoggles. I love trains. I ride a train between Washington and New York all the time. I think trains are great. I just don't think you should have to pay for my trains. I think I should have to pay for my trains. But, of course, you are paying for my trains because the subsidy that goes to the Northeast Corridor, which is where the only viable trains in the United States really are, is paid by you. Now, we would have trains around the country, but we wouldn't have trains going through congressional district to congressional district to congressional district based on who chairs certain committees if we had a rational system. So that same principle, politics, which dictates where Amtrak goes, is dictating the high-speed rail movement. Now, Europe, of course, if you visit Europe, they have wonderful trains. I grew up partly in Europe. Every time I go there, I use the trains of France or Germany, and I marvel at what they can accomplish. And I remind myself, though, that all of Germany is the size of Oregon. All of California is basically the size of France. So they have a much more compact population, many more population centers. It makes sense, even though, of course, they still subsidize their trains up the wazoo. Here in this country, high-speed trains might make sense between Boston and Washington, the Boswash corridor we call it, but there's already so much development on either side of that, it would cost trillions of dollars to knock down all those buildings, build a high-speed rail train. So they're improving the track, and it is faster now, and that's a good thing. But what they're doing now is not talking about high-speed trains in the Northeast, they're talking about spreading it around the country. Las Vegas to Los Angeles is a perfect example we can discuss, or shall we say Los Angeles to Victorville, that sprawling metropolis in the desert. California voters narrowly, 52-48, approved a limited, scaled-back, carefully crafted high-speed rail proposal back in 2008, which was pegged at about $20 billion. It's now $69 billion and climbing. But Governor Brown is ignoring the voters who now say they would vote against it if they had the chance to again. He's ignoring all of the constitutional violations that the High-Speed Rail Authority has built up. And he's using the cap and trade money, which is basically a disguised gasoline tax, to shift money from the motorists of California to his Tinker Toy set. Jerry Brown became famous in public life in the 1970s as Governor Moonbeam. Now he's going to go out of office as Governor Mad Choo Choo. The line that he's building is dependent on certain federal funds and other funds that are time limited. So they had to start construction last year, by January 1st, 2017, or they were going to lose the money. So they had to build somewhere. Couldn't build in the Bay Area because of the environmentalists, couldn't build in Los Angeles because they hadn't quite figured out how to plow through the mountains and the earthquake zones yet. So what did they do? They decided to start building in California's wonderfully scenic and populated Central Valley, which is an agricultural breadbasket and one of the places I grew up in, and it's a wonder of the world, but it is not heavily populated. The first stretch of road is going to connect a small town on the outskirts of Fresno called Firebaugh, population 717, I'm sorry, just went down, 716. Firebaugh with that bustling suburb of Merced called Coalinga, a stretch of 33 miles, which is only going to cost about $9 billion, which they estimate will give the access of 0.3% of California's population will be able to take a high-speed rail line between Coalinga and Firebaugh. I don't know what you do when you get to either place, except go to your car in the parking lot and drive somewhere else, but that's what we're going to do. Other states, of course, have seen the folly of this and dropped the taxpayer subsidies. Wisconsin, Ohio, Florida, all dropped the subsidies after President Obama offered them as part of the stimulus package in 2009 and 10. They were smart. But it still rears its head. Now that the Las Vegas Raiders have their new stadium, everybody says, well, the way to get fans to come from Los Angeles to see the Raiders is to build high-speed rail to Las Vegas. Have a winning team. And the taxpayers will be the losing team. So, They originally were trying to get federal loan money to build the choo-choo train from Los Angeles or Victorville. Then they gave that up because the feds thought it didn't make any sense. Then they went to the Chinese, our friends. And the Chinese were going to provide all the Tinker Toy trains. And the Chinese even pulled out. So now they're off scavenging for more money and more loans. That's a danger out there. Harry Reid isn't in the Senate, but his friends are still out there. I couldn't possibly comment, but there are problem children out there. Emphasis on the children. But then there's Texas. Texas, they were smart, because Texas is an individualistic state. It's a small government state. So the Texas High-Speed Rail Project said, we're not going to use a penny of public money. It will all be private, raised privately. We're going to have a train that goes from Dallas to Houston in 90 minutes. The only thing we need is some eminent domain, if the people won't sell their properties to us. Well, that didn't sit well with Texas property owners or their county governments. Of the 11 counties that would have part of the high-speed rail system in it, 9 have already voted against it. The only 2 that are voting for it are the ones that contain Dallas and the one that contains Houston, which are both, of course, run by liberal Democrats. So there's been a big fight. And the Democrats are so intent on this, they sent Joe Biden out last year. One of the last things they wheeled him out for as vice president. And he announced in Dallas, Texas, you have developed a new model of public-private partnership that will change everything and create a new era of transportation. The same day that he said that, the lead consultant for the high-speed rail project, Ron Kirk, the former mayor of Dallas and Obama's former trade representative, announced, well, of course there won't be a penny of public money spent on this, but loans we can talk about. Loans, of course, that we know will be fully repaid at a good rate of interest, of course, as they always are. So Texas is in the middle of this great debate. Where do you come in? Very simply, just say no. I just was in Colorado. They're talking about the trains to the mountains, a ski train that will run from the Denver airport up to Aspen and Vail and all those places where people, of course, can't afford to drive, can't afford to pay their own way. I mean, a subsidy for skiers now. I like trains. Trains can make sense. Elon Musk has this vision after he's going to build Tesla of the Hyperloop, which is going to have a tube running underground that will use vacuums and speed people along at 600 miles an hour, going from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 38 minutes. Maybe, but let him pay for it. He certainly is making us pay for his Tesla. And that's the bottom line here. I'm in favor of technology, I'm in favor of progress, I'm in favor of trains. But if you have a good idea, you do it the old-fashioned way. Yes, the railroads originally in this country had rights of way from the federal government, but they basically paid their own way. Yes, the automobile companies had the roads built to some extent, but we mostly paid for them because of gas taxes and other things. The principle here should be, if you think your idea is good enough, go seek private financing. And if you can get it, more power to you. And if you can't, don't expect the taxpayers to subsidize you going down to something that's the equivalent of the train casino and rolling the dice over and over again and throwing snake eyes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I'm going to speak next, and I'm going to return us to some of the themes of the election. Many of you may recall that in 2016, of course, immigration was one of the issues, but so was our military and the concern of rebuilding it as a result of 8 years of kind of hostility towards our our military, and also, quite frankly, trying to fight terrorism on the cheap. And so we have this aging military, and in terms of our materiel, most of the jets we have in the military are older than I am. Certainly, most of our bombers are, things like that, tanks, etc. And we've been kind of surviving on past commitments, if you will, to our freedom, not commitments that Barack Obama made. And one of the things that I think helped President Trump win on Election Day was the fact that he made it clear he was committed to our military. And I want to talk a little bit about that, but from a slightly different angle. I think it's important, of course, that we make sure that our fighting men and women have exactly what they need to fight those battles, the very best equipment, the very best supplies, and so forth. But we also have to be able to supply them. And so I want us to talk a little bit about how that happens, because there are those that want to get rid of this, and sometimes they'll use some of our conservative lingo or language to make it happen, and so I think this is an important fact. So there's this thing called the Jones Act. It was passed back in 1920. It was right after World War I. For those of you who are historians, you may recall we weren't terribly prepared in World War I. We weren't the only ones. The French sent their soldiers into battle wearing cloth caps, not helmets. As you may recall, in the first few months of the war, just months, there were millions of deaths and casualties. It was the sort of thing that had that continued, the war could not have lasted as long as it did, because you just can't have people. I mean, I don't know how you dig enough graves to bury people at the rate they were dying. No one was terribly prepared for this, and after the war was over, we made a commitment to make sure we were prepared. And one of those was we passed the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And the basic point of it was just designed to make sure that we had a viable shipbuilding, ship repair, and merchant marine. Now, you may wonder, why would that matter? Because what you really need is bombers and fighters and battleships and aircraft carriers, you name it. Well, let's talk a little bit about history and so forth, but before I jump that, I just want to give us one quick thing. The Jones Act does a couple things. This is the way it works. In order to You can ship things from other countries to the United States, happens every day, and we have international ports. They can come to that port from wherever in the world. But what they can't do then is leave that port in the United States and then go to the next port in the United States and then sail up the Mississippi and go around, and they basically have to leave. And from that point on, then American shippers are involved. They have to be U.S. built, U.S. flagged. The crews have to be 75% American citizens, etc. Now, that's basically what it does. And you can say, why should I care? Or, oh, that's regulation. We don't want that. Let me tell you why it matters. And from this, we get we can look at history. As I've kind of, there are detractors that we'll talk about it's protectionist or that, not a good idea. But this is why it really matters. In history, in 1812, the greatest army, the greatest land army that had ever existed on the planet at that time, left about 700,000 strong from France, led by Napoleon. And they worked their way towards Russia. And in every single engagement, they crushed the Russians. But I think you all know the history here. It didn't turn out real well. And there's a reason for this. And it wasn't because it got cold, quite frankly. It was because the Russians burned everything in their path, and slowly but surely, his army started to starve, started to freeze. They ran out of things they needed to fight. Now, let me just get to the end of the story very quickly. By the time they got back to France, this 700,000 greatest army the world had ever seen had lost 380,000 men in battle, 100,000 captured. All but 27,000 of the remaining were so sick they could not fight, and they slowed the retreat. So the balance of power in Europe radically shifted at that moment. And why was it? It wasn't because Russia was cold, there was a big bitter, or any of that stuff. It was because they did not have the means to supply their army. And I think that's what we have to make sure we are careful of. So The reason for this is to make sure that America has a sea lift capability. That's the most important way that America can project its power. We have aircraft carriers, but we have to make sure they have the things they need. We spent 6 months putting in place before the first desert operation in Iraq. And that was because we were shipping things over. And it takes a lot of sea lift capability. So there are those who say we need to get rid of it because it's an old statute, because you go back in 1920 is a long time ago. And therefore, because it's old, it can't possibly be a good idea. But I think that's kind of silly logic. But at any rate, the Navy's pretty clear at what they think of it. They say that to undermine the Jones Act would hamper America's ability to meet strategic sea lift requirements and Navy shipbuilding, and I might add repair as well. So they've consistently opposed these efforts, and I think it's important that we understand that this isn't just the Navy doesn't actually have any interest in helping American shipbuilders other than its own interest, which is making sure it has access to being able to have that sea lift capability. So in times of war, the advantage, of course, is that these American flag ships can be converted immediately into use by our U.S. military if they need them. And in some cases, the mariners on those ships will be given responsibilities on naval ships, too. So it becomes important, and it's a way for them to move these things rapidly. And let me just ask you real quick, what do you think would happen? I have a few people, I'm very free market oriented, and I'm actually pro-trade. But ask yourself this. We decide we don't need to have our own sea lift capability, and we'll just contract that out. And the low bid contractor on that turns out that it's China or Russia. And so we load up all of our best technology, military technology, in crates on their ships. And they're at sea for weeks or a month on their way halfway around the world. What do you think the chances are that those things aren't degraded, reverse engineered, look for weaknesses, maybe even plant weaknesses in them through software or whatever, and then crated back up and then delivered to our fighting men and women abroad? I think the chance is pretty high. So I don't really understand why people think it doesn't matter that we have the ability to do that ourselves. To me, it matters. Well, anyhow, so the Navy, of course, has made it clear that they think this is critical. America has, because of competition, because, quite frankly, foreign countries so heavily subsidize, whether it's Korea or China or even Russia, they subsidize. And so we've had a shrinking shipbuilding industry in America over the last several decades. But we still have one, and they can build some of the best ships in the world. And we don't have to necessarily build most of the ships in the world, but we have to retain the ability to build some and to repair some. And the Jones Act is important to that. So if you just to give us a little bit in history of kind of how this worked, if you look at during Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, both 2002, 2010, commercial ships, American commercial ships, transported about 60% of everything that went there. And then, of course, the Navy did some of its own shipping, and even there, they got most of their mariners to handle those things because of the Jones Act. So I think it's hard to argue that we don't need it or that it doesn't have practical help. Of course, the Department of Defense has been pretty clear. They say the ability of the nation to build and maintain a U.S. flagged fleet is in the national interest. And I think unless we don't want to listen to the story of Napoleon, we know that. It has an added benefit, though, because it helps us secure our borders. As I've said, we have, in our international ports, we have a lot of infrastructure there to protect our security. And I would argue we probably need more. We need to be able to check out cargo more carefully as it comes in. But imagine if you now said that every single port in America, off every single river, is now going to effectively become an international port of call. I think it makes sense that we are essentially limiting other countries' access to the heartland of America. And just to give you an idea, nobody allows other countries to conduct business in their country as under the rules of the foreign country. So let me give you an example. Let's say a Japanese auto manufacturer. They exist here in the United States. They hire Americans to work, and they live by America's rules and regulations and laws, right? Imagine if they put a fence around that and said, oh, yeah, we can operate here, but we're going to operate under our home laws, not U.S. laws. We're going to use Japanese laws. That's what it would be like if we said to shipping country, shippers coming in, yeah, you can go anywhere you want. You can operate wherever you want. Because we're basically then saying you can operate under your country's rules in our country doing a business. And that just doesn't strike me as a very sustainable model, if you will. At any rate, as I said, I think from a homeland security perspective, it makes a big difference. When you have Americans who have security clearances and so forth operating these ships in our coastal waters, they're much, could someone infiltrate it in some way? I'm sure somebody could theoretically, but it makes it much harder. You can imagine that you and I and other red-blooded Americans care a lot more about security. If they see something funny going on, they'll do something about it. Whereas, imagine if you have an Iranian ship. What do you think the chances are that an Iranian captain and his crew will be worried if they see something odd going on their ship? My guess is they'll be behind what's going odd on their ship. But at any rate, I would argue that the 2016 election was a lot about national security and border security and homeland security. Those are important issues. And again, to me, the Jones Act plays an important role in that, but it has the disadvantage of not being sexy because it's about merchant marine. It's old, 1920. But I think it's important, and sometimes we miss that. I also have people say it's protectionist, but I would argue it's about protecting America. And that's an important distinction in my view. When it comes to national security, I don't know about you, but I don't want to buy my missile defense from the Russians. I'd like to have Americans developing our missile defense. And when it comes to other capabilities with defending a country, we better be the ones providing it. I think it's fine if we want to buy T-shirts somewhere that's cheap. I'm not sure I want to buy my military and national security sensitive stuff from other people. That's just an altogether different problem. So, of course, the Jones Act is also taxpayer friendly. I have a couple of friends that said, George, the real answer is the Navy should have its own full merchant marine. That's what they should do. And then we wouldn't need the Jones Act. They just have a bunch of extra ships and crews, and they can do it all themselves. And the answer is that would cost $65 billion to do that. So I want to ask you, if we're going to do that, which aircraft carriers do you want to mothball? Which VA hospitals do you want to close? Which new weapon systems that are aging, to replace the new ones, to replace the aging ones, do you want to cancel and just say, never mind, we don't need that? And I think that's a critical thing here. This is taxpayer friendly, and it's military national security friendly. Just give you a couple quotes. You have the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff making it very clear he's a supporter of the Jones Act. He asked, why would I tamper with this? You can go to the commander of the U.S. Transportation Command. He gives you the same message, different words, the exact same message. He said, we need it because we need a robust and a serious sea lift capability, a ship repairing capability. We've seen ships recently, have collisions. Those ships have to be repaired. They'll do some repairs overseas quickly, but those will come back to port, and then Americans will do the real repairs and put them back into the original shape they were in. That matters. Here you've got the Coast Guard Commandant, exact same measurement. And he asked, what would the world look like in 10 years if we're stuck buying our sea lift capability, our ship building capability, our ship repair capability from foreign powers? Like I said, I don't think that's a lot different than saying we'll buy our fighter jets, we'll buy our bombers from the Russians, we'll buy our missile defense from the Chinese. Not a good idea. So what should you do? I just think you need to remember this one fact, because you will hear people that sometimes agree with us on lots of issues. They may agree with us on tax reform or on Obamacare, and they'll get the bright idea because someone's conned them with, I think, what I would call these words that conservatives talk about and tell we don't need it. But I think you have to remember, that's not what history says. It's not what the facts say. And it's certainly not what our military says. So I just want you to remind, one of the things, Herman Cain talked about we need to do more. Reach out to your members of Congress and tell them that even if the Jones Act isn't sexy, we want them to focus on real things that matter. Things like immigration reform, things like changing our tax code, getting the economy rolling again. Those sorts of things are much more important, and they should preserve the Jones Act because it actually makes us safer. I want to remind you of that because sometimes in Washington, I get the impression now that they are worried about doing anything at all. And so they just like, okay, fine, we got to pass something. So I could see some of them going to the Jones Act and then trying to talk about how they're doing something good for America, and they're not. And they're also wasting time where they could actually be doing important things. So don't let them off the hook by saying something will do. They got to do something real, something important, something that matters. And I think Herman Cain gave us some good clues as where that would go. So I want to close as I began by thanking you, because I really do believe that because our future is bright, and it's bright because there's people like you here. If I'd come here today and there'd been nobody here, I'd have been a little worried. And I'd gone home to my wife and said, you know what? We have some problems. We've become complacent. And so I appreciate the fact that you demonstrate that's not the case and that we're not complacent. So with that, I will turn the microphone over to Travis Korson. Thank you so much.
Where's my slideshow? There it is. Thank you, George. Quick show of hands. How many of you are generally consider yourselves fans of the EPA? In this room, that's about what I would expect to see, and I'm glad I got all of your attention. I'd be concerned if any hands went up. Now,
EPA.
let me rephrase the question. How many of you are fans of what Scott Pruitt is doing at the EPA at the moment? Good, good. A few more hands. Well, I'm gonna talk to you today about an important issue that's going on with the EPA and how the new administrator, Scott Pruitt, has really taken the lead in cleaning up what has been basically a extortion organization for energy producers and providers for a long time. I'm going to talk to you today about a landfill. And you may wonder, what do I care about a landfill that happens to be in the middle of Missouri, thousands of miles away from here? What does it have to do with me? Well, there are a lot of things that have implications across the country. EPA failures and scandals, robbing taxpayers, growth of government, padding the pockets of unions once again, and democratic doublespeak. We're bringing you this issue today because it is emblematic of the clever ways that the left tries to grow government, shrink constitutional limits on government, and get its hands into taxpayers' pockets. So let me just give you a little bit of background about the Westlake landfill. It's near St. Louis, Missouri, and it started as a limestone quarry in the 1930s. Once the quarry was exhausted, it became a landfill. You dig a hole, you fill it back up. During its life as a landfill, there was some low-level radiological material from the Manhattan Project that was mixed in the regular waste. So this was before there was really an understanding about some of the dangers of this material. This is around the same time when they were conducting the nuclear tests just outside of Las Vegas, so you could see the mushroom cloud from the Strip. Now this material was low-level radiological. It's called leached barium sulfate. Low level, but someone was buried there. In 1990, they had realized the material was there, and the site was listed as a Superfund site. For the next 25 years, the EPA has been studying it over and over again, coming up with different plans, coming up with different ways to try to solve the problem. You know, millions of dollars in taxpayer money later, here's where we are. Look, locals complain about the smell, and landfills smell. There's no if or too much about it. They don't make great neighbors. But what's been happening at this particular landfill is there has been basically a smoldering underground that has caused the smell to be a little bit worse. Perfectly natural, because when things decompose, they give off heat. Think of, if you see a pile of mulch in the morning, you'll see the heat coming off of it. It's a natural part of the process. The smoldering waste is not near the radiological waste, and there have been several studies that have been conducted to make sure that it poses no risk. The CDC has said there's no health risk to local residents. The EPA has done several studies where they found that. State and local agencies have done studies. They found it. As recently as this past May 19th, the EPA said that there was no risk to the residents around there. Even the fake news Washington Post agreed that there was no risk to any of the residents as far as the health was concerned. So after 25 years, the EPA is finally ready to fix the problem. And look, we understand that the locals are frustrated because it's been 25 years of inaction, of waiting, of being ignored. They win no awards for responsiveness or efficiency, but they have a plan and they're ready to set it into action. So what's the plan? Well, first of all, most importantly, it's not going to cost taxpayers a dime. It's a long time coming, but basically it deals with the waste by building a wall. No, not the wall that you hear about all the time. This is a different wall. But building a wall to contain this smoldering waste that's going on. There's going to be a capping of the waste, and then there's going to be continuous monitoring for a long period after it could theoretically pose any risk to residents of the water, air, soil, make sure there's no contamination around there. Won't cost taxpayers a dime because Superfund is a trust fund that's set aside to pay for these kind of cleanups. And the owner of the landfill is also going to be putting some funds forward towards the cleanup. But we've been 25 years, right, waiting in action. Why should we believe anything is different now? Well, there's a new sheriff in town, and his name is Scott Pruitt. For those of you who don't know Scott Pruitt, he's the former Oklahoma Attorney General. He has a record of opposing bad climate deals, suing the government. He was a big opponent of the Clean Power Plan, and he really has been an action-oriented EPA administrator. He was on Fox and Friends back in May talking about this particular issue, where he said, quote, "There are examples where the EPA just didn't take any steps at all. We have a site just outside of St. Louis called Westlake that's taken the EPA 27 years just to make a decision, not to clean it up, but just to make a decision on what should be done to clean it up." And for him, that was unacceptable. He's also worked with members of Congress and has received praise from members of Congress. John Shimkus, in particular, his district is in Illinois, but it borders St. Louis and Westlake. He's met with Pruitt on 3 separate occasions. He's a key House Energy and Commerce Committee member. And he said, quote, "Pruitt knows more about Westlake than the last 2 EPA administrators combined, and I would ask my colleagues to give him the time to prove it." Now, do you think his Democratic colleagues were going to go along with this? Absolutely not. 1 week to the day of that Fox and Friends interview that Pruitt had, I just mentioned, Senator Claire McCaskill and Rep. Lacey Clay of the Cops Are Pigs painting fame that he hung up in the Capitol, dropped bills to transfer control of project away from the EPA and towards the Army Corps of Engineers. Now you may wonder, why do I care that it goes away from the EPA to the Army Corps? Well, there are a couple of really important things here to keep in mind. First of all, it starts the entire process over, right? So much for getting it back on track. The Army Corps will have to come in, do their own studies, come up with their own plan. So all the 27 years worth of work from the EPA will get wiped out. While the Army Corps is reputable, this isn't really their wheelhouse. They don't do cleanup projects like this. But the real reason why she wants to do this, it's a big payday for all her unionized labor buddies. The EPA cleanup is going to be done with non-unionized labor, but the Army Corps is going to have to use Davis-Bacon and a lot of different prevailing wage laws that will require her union buddies to come in and get some nice cushy contracts. Also, because it's no longer a Superfund project, that trust fund's no longer available. The owner of the site is no longer responsible for paying for the cleanup, so taxpayers are on the hook for the $400 million it could cost to pay for this cleanup. So as you can see, it's amazing how Democrats change their tone on the EPA once the EPA focuses the full force of its power to clean contaminated sites quickly, instead of utilizing the power of the agency to advance partisan efforts such as the war on coal, the Clean Power Plan, and just their general war on cheap and reliable energy for Americans. This is what happens when the EPA focuses on partisan witch hunts instead of their core mission. This is exactly what we get. Today, we have an opportunity to reorient the EPA to its original mission and prove, when properly managed, it can handle these Superfund cleanups. So what should you do? First of all, contact your members, tell them H.R. 2632, that's the House bill, and S. 1211, tell them this is a bad bill, don't let it see the light of the day, kill it in committee. If it gets to the floor, vote against it, because all of the bad things that I just lined out, this is what these bills do. Pruitt has talked about reorienting the EPA, saying, quote, "The Superfund program is a vital function of the Environmental Protection Agency, and under my administration, Superfund and EPA's land and water cleanup efforts will be restored to their rightful place at the center of the agency's mission." For lack of a better phrase, Scott Pruitt is working to make the EPA great again, and we should help support him in that mission. Thank you very much. Glad to be here, and I think we may have time for a few questions.
We do. We need to get us back on schedule or work towards that. So we'll take a few questions, but not too many. And if you can keep your questions brief and avoid the temptation to give alternative speeches, that would be awesome.
Your plan is great for fighting World War II. We're not in World War II times anymore. They showed that they could shoot satellites down for pennies of what you're talking about. There are rumors that these ships that are hitting freighters out in the middle of the ocean that their guidance systems are being controlled by
Yeah, the Navy's looking at that now. Exactly. Oh, I totally agree with you that we always have to have our eye on the future, but the reality is there will never be a day where we will not have to be able to supply our troops. And we have to, and so there's just certain fundamentals. Troops have to eat, troops have to have things to, whether you're sending special forces to fight terrorists, they still have to have things, and we have to get them to them reliably. But my remarks were definitely not suggesting that's the only thing we should focus on. We have, at Frontiers of Freedom, for example, been major advocates of a space-based missile defense system for precisely the reasons you're talking about. Space is where it's going to be at. Our opponents are focusing on space, and we're stupid not to. And if we ignore that, we do that at our own peril. The world has bad people in it.
George, if I could just jump in on this too. It's important to note that both of the ships that rammed into these Navy vessels were foreign flagged vessels. And when we go back to talking about the standards for American ships versus foreign ships, there are certain cyber hardening standards that American ships have to meet that foreign flagged vessels don't. So there's a vulnerability that exists for those foreign flagged vessels that doesn't necessarily exist for American vessels because of that reason. So.
Right, that's a fair point. Yes, sir.
The Jones Act of 1920, doesn't that kind of cause hampers to the modern cruise industry?
It doesn't, because the modern cruise industry, they tend to come to American port and then go around and go to different places. We have, they're not primarily a,
If I want to go from San Francisco to Hawaii, then it's got to take a side trip to Mexico before it comes back to San Francisco.
perhaps so. And you could argue that's a big problem, but at least when I've been on cruises, I didn't really mind the trip to wherever it was. And I'm a lot more concerned about making sure that America is secure and safe than I am worried about whether we have to add a stop to comply with the rules for a cruise liner. I can't, the two can't be equalized to me. One's critically important, it's mission critical, and one is kind of... Well, I'm willing to consider looking at those issues to see what impact it would have on national security. But my main concern is I don't really want to see Congress just open the can up and go at it, because I think there are people that don't care that much about our national security. I would argue that there's one side of the aisle that could not care less. So.
Foreign flagged cruise ships have to touch foreign soil before if they leave an American
Right.
And that's been in process as long as I've been in the travel industry for over 50 years.
Yeah, it may be a problem. I don't know, but at least on any cruise I've ever been on, I never considered it a big deal that and of course, an American flagged ship can, of course, do whatever. But if it's a foreign flagged ship with a foreign crew, then they have to abide by these rules.
Well, and to get back to your point, it's about supply and demand. There was an American flagged carrier that did a San Francisco to Hawaii cruise. You know what happened? The jet airplane was invented. Everyone decided that they would fly there instead, and the demand doesn't exist for that.
Right.
But you
About
look
the
at your Caribbean
70s, they
cruise-
phased out and they changed their business model because they weren't getting enough business. So yeah, you're right. And it's kind of like, I think that's the whole problem with high-speed trains, quite frankly. We have a way to get from New York to LA in a high-speed way. And we don't have to buy any land between LA and New York because air is for free. And, so, some of the principles kind of cross all of our topics. Yes, sir.
I have a question for John Fund about the high-speed rail. I am very distinct in my memory that our former U.S. Senator, dingy Harry Reid, was a huge advocate of this high-speed rail between here and
Victorville.
yeah, in Victorville, right, out in the desert. And, and of course, we know, like you said about Governor Moonbeam, and I think back to, our friends Woodward and Bernstein in the Watergate days when they said, follow the money. Do we have any evidence of how these guys have been greased by the interests that want to build these things to keep pushing for this high-speed rail?
Well, there's certainly speculation, there's certainly insinuation, and there's certainly circumstantial evidence. I personally believe that one of the reasons Harry Reid chose to retire is the level of scrutiny accorded to a United States Senator who is in office in a powerful position is dramatically more than a former United States Senator. Lots of reporters who may be sniffing around go away once you leave office. That's one of the reasons why you find so many people who go before the Ethics Committee and their way of resolving the issue is to quietly retire or not run for another term. So I don't want to go into the specifics. I do know that Harry Reid and suspect real estate deal are a natural fit on any Google search you want to make.
Yeah. So when you do that on Google, you do not get a return of nothing.
You get a rich vein.
A rich vein of research. Fair enough. Any other questions? Very good. I want to thank you so much for your attention.